Along with Interim Chancellor Dana Thomas, Brian Rodgers enjoys the distinction of having attended UAF as a student. Through his long association with the school and UA statewide, he brings a unique set of experiences and memories to share with us tonight. Brian was born in Blue Hill, Maine. During his childhood, he and his family lived in various communities in Maine, Connecticut, and Massachusetts as his father practiced his career as a high school principal. Brian attended both Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. But wanderlust and the prospect of a summer job fighting fires brought him and his friends north to Alaska in 1970. While his friends departed in the fall, Brian stayed. He began taking classes at the University of Alaska, and he'd go on to earn a master's in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Early experiences at UAF beyond the academic studies included a stint at the student newspaper, the Polar Star, and as senator at UA's Associated Students. Brian also became an entrepreneur when he and a partner started the Lemon Tree, a lemonade and sandwich stand on campus. During this time, he also met his future wife and life partner, Sherry Madro. In 1978, Brian successfully ran for the Alaska House for District 20. It's worth noting that while serving in Juneau, Brian was the chair of the University Budget Subcommittee. Brian left political office in 1982 and 2 years later accepted a post as University of Alaska's first Director of Budget Development. Later, he became Vice President for Finance, serving in that role until 1995. At that point, he started a successful management and administrative systems firm called Information Insights. But Brian's connection with the university wasn't wholly severed. In 1999, Governor Tony Knowles appointed Brian to the University of Alaska Board of Regents, and he served on the board until 2007. 2 years, he was the chair. In 2008, President Mark Hamilton asked him to become interim chancellor of UAF. A year later, he was asked to assume that job permanently. He stepped down in 2015. Please welcome Brian Rodgers. So it's so much fun having you here. Again, as I've said to all these, if you have trouble hearing, we have independent mics here on the thing. So just let us know if you have trouble hearing and we'll use the house microphones. We're also mic'd to handle the video production. So Brian, your father was a principal. I'm guessing that higher education was always going to be in the cards for you?
It was always going to be in the cards. My great-grandparents were college professors. All four of my grandparents went to college, the same college actually, and both my parents did, and so it was expected, I think, that that college is part of the role of everyone in the family.
So kind of a cottage industry.
Yeah.
Yeah. You were born in Blue Hill, Maine. What was your childhood like?
Well, growing up in the 50s in a small rural communities in Maine and suburb of Massachusetts it was easy living. We always spent part of the summer in Maine. My dad, being a principal, had the same time off that we had from school, and so Maine became an important part. In fact, continues to be. We were there just a month ago at the same cottage I went to in the 50s.
Wow. Now, you attended both Trinity College and Brown University, but were drawn to Alaska to fight fires. But was that for money or was that for adventure?
Yes. You know, that summer I actually was planning to go to Panama with a church group for the summer, and that trip fell apart. And a group of fraternity brothers were all headed to Alaska to fight forest fires, and I thought, well, that sounds good. I'll join them. And I remember getting off the plane in Anchorage and thinking, there's something special about this place, and didn't go back.
Wow. Now, when you started at UAF, you began some work at the Polar Star. So I have to ask you, was journalism ever a career you thought about seriously pursuing?
Well, yes, it was, but I have to correct you. I started at UA. There was no UAF at that time. It was.
I stand corrected.
and that was very important to some people at the time. But yes, I thought journalism might be a career, and it did play a role. I worked for the All Alaska Weekly newspaper. Later, ended up as one of the owners of the All Alaska Weekly, a weekly newspaper. Learned at that time that the best way to make a small fortune in the newspaper business is to start with a large one, and worked. I think the journalism experience, though, played a significant role in the consulting business. Sort of an approach to fact gathering, and our research-based consulting used that experience. So while my career wasn't in journalism per se, I certainly used that experience.
Yeah. You also became UA student senator or UAF student senator?
UA.
UA student senator. Now, in that role, you were a leader for the student body, but did you have a model? Did you have a mentor for what it was to be a leader?
Well, I think I gained some from my father as a school principal, learning how he adapted to situations and sort of was not an authoritarian type leader. I think I learned far more from experience working with other people and just learning as I went rather than having a specific role. Although I think in later days the concept of servant leadership or adaptive leadership, where the leader's role is not one of telling people what to do, but really harnessing the energy of the group to get something done. I think that played much more of a role, that concept of leadership.
Hmm. Around this time too, you became an entrepreneur. You started the Lemon Tree. You also met your life partner, Sherry, and eventually become. I'm wondering too, as you talk about your experiences and how they played a role later in life, you must have gained some entrepreneurial chops running the stand.
So the Lemon Tree was a lemonade truck. We fixed up an old mail truck and sold lemonade, fresh lemonade, limeade, orange juice on campus. And I think I learned a lot about business and accounting, but I also learned something about the university bureaucracy at the time when the vice president tried to have me kicked off campus. And there's actually a person in the audience, Ron Kais, who argued against that. And one of the reasons I was able to stay on campus was his figuring out how to work around the university bureaucracy to get something that people wanted. And I think that experience of understanding if you really want to serve people, you don't let the rules get in your way. That was an important lesson.
Yeah, I'll bet it was. Now, let's talk about some of the other leadership roles that you successfully ran for office and became House of Representative. But what drew you to politics?
Well, I think it was feeling that in Alaska, politics could make a difference. I actually ran the first time in '74 and lost narrowly. I was only 24 years old at the time. But Mike Bradner, who was then Speaker of the House of Representatives, invited me to serve on his staff, and I spent 3 sessions in Juneau working for him, working for Clark Greening, Steve Cooper, several others, and that experience of seeing who was making policy and how it was being made at a very heady time for the state. The state had money for the first time in the mid-'70s and was trying to catch up on a lot of infrastructure and other things. And it was clear that in a small legislature, one person can make a difference, which actually was my campaign slogan, that one person can make a difference.
Yeah. Well, it's worth taking a break here and kind of talk about that relationship the school has had with the legislature, because right now it's seeing some challenges. The legislature isn't fully funding the school, and so can you talk a little bit about, from that perspective, how lawmakers view the college and the university system, and why they're not taking perhaps a more active role?
I think it's changed over time. Certainly, at the time I first started getting involved in Alaska politics, there was much more support for the university and the university system. There wasn't as much regionalization of the system at the time. It was really thought of as one university as opposed to now 3 universities. And so people who thought about higher education thought about the whole state. Now, I think legislators who think about higher education tend to think about it, about the portion of the university that's in their districts or near their districts. So that sort of atomization, I guess, of the experience has changed somewhat. I think a second is a loss of appreciation for what research brings in terms of benefits to the state. We've tried over time to try to help people understand what the value is, but it's not always the case. At the time I was in the legislature, the majority of legislators didn't have college degrees. And I think that not having been part of this experience is one way that people don't understand it. And I think now with as science starts becoming politicized, we're seeing some people move away from support for research and science because it doesn't fit their views of how the world should work. So yeah, I think it's been on a negative path, both in Alaska and elsewhere. I just saw a study that looked at the 50 states and the funding of public higher education, and it has declined throughout the country over the last decade. While we've had it pretty bad, many states have had it far worse over the decade. We actually climbed for part of it and then went down. There are states that have lost a third of their funding from 10 years ago in real terms, and that I'm worried about what that means for the future of the nation.
Sure. I mean, we talk about investing in our infrastructure. Well, in terms of human resources, universities do represent our infrastructure in an important sense.
Yes. And I think the research enterprise at public universities is part of the engine of economic development. And I think losing that edge means other nations that invest more will do better than the U.S. does.
Well, the other, I mean, we're all watching Game of Thrones, so we know what a saga is. But the land grant status of the university equals anything on television for the intricacies. But we have never received our full allotment of land granted.
Well, we sort of received it, but it got taken away. The federal government actually designated Section 16 and 36, but at the time of statehood, the statehood land grant was so substantial that Congress felt that the state could take care of it. Governor Egan vetoed the first land grant bill to the university because he thought the state could manage and that the state should fund the university instead of providing land. And now it does neither very well. And so of the 50 states, we have either the bottom or the second to the smallest land grant of any of the states in what is the largest state. We've had legislation pass and be vetoed. We've had legislation pass and be thrown out in the courts. If it's for educational purposes, we've been able to get the land we need. But in terms of land for investment purposes, other than one significant land settlement in the mid-1980s, we haven't received much at all. And what we did receive primarily funds the UA Scholars Program today.
Well, let's bring you back to the university from your stint down in Juneau. You were tapped to become the statewide, Director of Budget Development. What is that?
So the legislature expects from the university a single budget request. At the time, there were 5 major administrative units of the university: Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, Anchorage Community College, and the rest of the community colleges as a block. And so assembling that budget that was a single budget for the university, figuring out what the themes needed to be, working with the president and the president's cabinet on how to present the university to the state. That was the role of the budget director job. It also was the monitoring of the budget over the course of the year to ensure that we were following the budget directions that came from the governor and legislature, and really working strategically on how to change the relationship between the university and the legislature over the budget. In the late 1970s, the university had had a budget collapse. They didn't know how much money they had in hand, didn't know how much was coming to them, and the state essentially took receivership of the university in 1977 or 78, and we ended up with 133 separate appropriations, each one a separate pot of money, and you could only spend from that pot for that purpose. And part of my role as budget director was to work that number down. We got it down to 6 or 7, and now it's down to 1.
Yeah. Phew.
Yes.
Well, as you mentioned, you became director of vice president, for finance, and served in that role until '95. And between your job as budget development and vice president of finance, the state saw that late '80s kind of dip in oil prices and in support for the university. A lot of people point to that as a sort of anticipating what we're experiencing today. Do you care to talk about or reflect on that at all?
Yeah, it was in my just at the end of my second year as budget director in 1986 that the price of oil crashed, and it meant the state had far less money available to it than was expected. The university had a budget that year from the state of about $170 million, and the governor, between the legislature and the governor, they restricted it down to about $135 million. So almost a $35 million cut with about a month's notice. We actually negotiated our way back up a little bit by canceling some capital projects, but it was as significant a one-year hit as any university has seen. We'd been flush for several years. We'd actually 3 years earlier had a budget increase of over 30%. So I think there was some room to start addressing that, but it became clear to President O'Dowd and the Board of Regents that we were going to have to change the way we were organized. So while I was still budget director, the president formed a team of 5 of us to work with him on coming up with a plan to restructure, and that's when we went from 5 units to 3 multi-mission universities. But it was a pretty tumultuous time. We had, in addition to losing lots of good people and many good programs, we had programs that were canceled in Fairbanks, but then people wanted them so much they came back in Anchorage. The WAMI medical education program was one of the budget cuts at that point. It fortunately survived. The restructuring plan was not universally appreciated. The legislative audit said $6 million worth of verifiable cuts came out of it, almost all to administration, but it meant no separate community college system. The community colleges were effectively merged with the universities. There were bills to try to separate it. There was an initiative to separate the community colleges from the university. We had to fight that. So pretty challenging times. We had a campaign called, the slogan was "Keep it together," and we were able to keep it together and keep a single system. But not easy, and lots of good people were no longer employed by the university following that tough budget cut.
Yeah, I remember those times. Though it could be now, keep calm and keep it together, right?
Yeah.
Having gone through those periods, you worked under 2 UA presidents, let's see, Donald O'Dowd and Jerome Commissar. What did you see in their leadership styles that you thought, that works, or maybe not doing that too much?
I'd highlight Don in particular. He was steady through those tumultuous times, and I think really kept a vision of where he wanted to go, and did not let it get to him. One of the things I had learned at least book learning in leadership classes in graduate school was about how leaders need to separate role from self, and the attacks that may happen are more because of your role, not because of who you are, and you have to just let those go by you. Don was a master at that, and it was good watching how he did that. I think the other piece was how how important getting the right team is. Don handpicked who was going to participate in that process. You know, there was lots of public input as well, but in terms of the team that was trying to craft a proposal, it was the people, you get the right people involved. And I drew on that, I think, when I became chancellor, thinking about how do you get the best team possible to manage leadership. So those were real positives. Jerry Komisar, I really liked him a lot, but he was president during a time that there was no new money. We weren't cutting, we weren't adding. It was very stable, and so I think not the same opportunities for great leadership during that period of time.
Well, it's so interesting, having talked to Wendy not long ago here. She observed that part of her responsibilities was to separate the president from lawmakers down in Juneau. You know, they said, just don't bring them down here, you know. And so I wonder, when you joined the Board of Regents, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but of course, the president is sort of like the chief conduit to lawmakers in many ways. They represent the university. Mm-hmm. And so do you think it's important for them to establish a stronger personal relationship with those down in Juneau, or better to kind of sit back and let your...
The answer, I think, is it depends. It really depends on the qualities of the president and the roles that he or she is most comfortable with. It works either way. You can have a president who is much more internally focused and has vice presidents who handle the external roles. And if you've got a Wendy Redmond, you don't need a president who's great at the external roles, because she was. And she had that long-standing relationship with legislators. You know, I'd known her since the early 70s, but when I was in the legislature, she was my primary contact at the university. Now, it was a different time then. We were rolling in money the second year in the legislature, and so I had to call her up and say, we don't have enough increments, can we get some more? Because we want to add more money to the university budget.
Oh, that sounds good. That's like...
But on the other hand, there are times where the legislature really responds well to the president. I think Mark Hamilton may have really exemplified that. There was a lot of respect for Don O'Dowd when he was speaking to the legislature, although there wasn't the same connection I think they made with Mark.
Well, I want to turn at least briefly to your time forming Information Insights and what you gleaned there, because of course that business, its primary responsibility was to make things work, make organizations more functional and dynamic. And so what did you learn through that process of leading that company and engaging in these challenges?
I really learned a lot, and I think a lot of it helped in my later work. One was working with a wide variety of organizations, doing strategic planning or doing business development, seeing the kinds of challenges they had, giving them advice, and then seeing if they took it, whether it worked or not. The group facilitation, I did a lot of facilitation of groups. Sometimes it was problem solving, sometimes it was strategic planning, and over time worked with not all, but many of the interest groups around Alaska. And I think later, when I became chancellor, that experience of working with people in the resource industry, people in human services, people in education, and with some of them thinking, where do they want to go, helped me think about how can the university help them in their plans. And so the facilitation work certainly helped. The research work, research-based consulting has some similarities to university organized research. And so I think it gave me some sense of how the great researchers here work. And so that was certainly a plus. And then serving on the Board of Regents at the same time, I was able, I think, to learn from that experience, seeing the university in all of its roles all over the state, and understanding how that played and what a difference that made for UA statewide as well as for UA Fairbanks.
Well, let's turn to the Board of Regents, but first I want to observe that having a skill set that is both good with people and good with numbers doesn't often coincide. So that must have, and we haven't acknowledged all the work you've done for other organizations, often serving on boards, as volunteer, as a consultant. So you really have had a broad-based experience of all sorts of groups at all various levels throughout the state. So it must have all come to play. Well, let's turn to the Board of Regents and talk about, because I had the chance of asking Mark Hamilton about his approach or his opinion of the Board of Regents, and he said, well-meaning people, but sometimes they don't really grasp the complexities.
Yes.
So you're a regent, so...
I was a regent during most of his term, in fact. And
I wasn't going to mention it.
And would say there were a couple of issues where he was a well-meaning president, but he really didn't get it. We had a big fight over tuition policy, for example, and that's been an ongoing battle between the administration and the board, with the board looking at the price of higher education and the value, and looking at the challenges that it creates, particularly for lower income Alaskans to be able to attend higher education, versus the administration looking at comparing our costs with alternatives, which are almost always higher, and seeing what additional revenues would bring. And so we went back and forth about that sometimes. I think the board's role of being an interface between what the public wants and needs and what the university wants and needs is important. We're a state university. We exist to support the people of the state, and universities, private colleges have the luxury of deciding where they want to go and going there. I think public universities need to be responsive to their communities. The good news is, when you are responsive to your community, the community can be responsive for you. And I think we saw that during my tenure, for example, when we needed significant help on facilities, and the community said, we will make that a community priority. I think that doesn't happen if you're not spending a lot of time listening to the community and participating in the community.
Well, let's bring you to UAF then as first interim and then as chancellor, because one of the issues that when we had Marshall Lind here, he said he was up nights worrying that the power plant would go down. And deferred maintenance has been an albatross around the neck of many of the chancellors here. And you had to tackle a big project with the power plant. Talk a bit about deferred maintenance.
Well, first, deferred maintenance, we really got into trouble in the mid-1980s when the budget was cut that $30+ million in a single year. One of the budget cuts we took was taking money out of the annual maintenance budget, because it was an easy place to go that didn't cost you programs and you thought you could recover from. Well, then we went into the years in the desert with flat funding, and that made the problem get worse. And the legislature was not funding major maintenance at the amount that you really needed to recap the facilities. And so, yeah, we got into trouble. And I think one of the lessons of that was that the legislature and the public that elects the legislature doesn't respond unless you make it a crisis, or at least a perceived crisis. And so in the early 1990s, UAF was able to point out some of the problems with maintenance and get some funding. And we actually made up a little bit in the early 1990s. When I came in, it was clear that the heat and power plant was a problem, but it was also clear the biology labs were the same biology labs that were here when I started in 1970. And so we needed to address life sciences before anything else, and we needed to get the community behind a combined heat and power plant upgrade, which was going to take some time. So we started with getting life sciences and creating a constituency for that. Actually, we decided we would team up with Anchorage at that time and sort of go in hand, We went for biology, they went for an arena. I think we got the better end of that deal and in the long run.
Sort of like tag team wrestling.
Yes. We did the same thing later with engineering, and one of the reasons we were able to get the engineering building. And so the first with life sciences addressed both research and teaching needs, engineering, both research and teaching needs, some other facilities along the way, but clearly the big issue was going to be heat and power. When we went through a disaster drill, thinking about what's the biggest disaster that could happen on this campus, what's the most likely disaster that could happen on this campus, it was the same thing. It was the heat and power plant going down in the middle of winter. And pretty quickly, the losses go up. You have buildings that start to freeze. You have research projects that die, literally. You have 1,500 students. You have to find a place to put up. And so we knew we had to do something. Building a community consensus meant showing that we had thought of every alternative, showing that any, what each possibility would cost, what the benefits would be, and what the risks were. Politics makes strange bedfellows. There were some legislators who I don't see eye to eye with on many issues who got it with that project and were able to bring the funding home. And it's bigger than I thought it was going to be. But it's, knowing that by this winter that facility should be online and providing us with heat and power for up to another 50 years is pretty good when the last one's already lived several years beyond its 50-year life.
Well, but I have to observe, when you went for a coal plant, I know you went out specifically to environmental groups and explained that, and really diffuse what could have been a very contested process by doing that. And again, I think that represents that outreach to constituents and stakeholders that
I knew that it was going to be important, and the team that we had working on it knew it was going to be important that people understood that we had really thought about alternatives and we had looked at what the possibilities were. And certainly being able to come in with a proposal for an expansion that lowered every regulated emission, that was a plus. Something that burned cleaner, that was a plus. And so we had virtually no opposition to the proposal as it went forward. It will be a far cleaner plant than what we have. It's not the ideal. The ideal might be natural gas. We looked at nuclear, and the time frame to get nuclear wouldn't work. We left no stone unturned. But had we built a plant for natural gas, I don't think we have a pipeline for natural gas to Fairbanks yet. Something seems to be happening there.
It's coming any day, though, Brian, honestly.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the far-flung campuses, let's say Kotzebue and Bethel and whatnot, that oftentimes, I know in fiscally challenging times, people point to them and say, you got to close them, we got to reduce to the core campuses. But they also provide those communities with great opportunities to higher education. Any thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. And I've long been a proponent of keeping those campuses. It's a relatively small part of the university budget that goes for funding the rural campuses. But for people who are place committed in rural Alaska, people who are going to be, who are or are going to be the nurses and the teachers and the other people who work in the community, they don't necessarily have the choice of coming in, of leaving family and home for 2 to 4 years to come to one of the urban campuses. And for anybody who says we should close them, I'd ask them to first go to a graduation at one of those campuses. You go to the graduation and you see the sense of community pride. The whole community shows up. We get a good crowd, but as a proportion of the community, the crowd in Bethel is far bigger than the crowd in Fairbanks. And the emotion, they can be very emotional experiences, including for those of us up on the stage. And there are some images that I'll never lose in my mind from those, and some speeches that I will always remember from the rural campuses. But again, it's a small part of the budget, big bang, big benefit in those communities, and I hope we never walk away from that.
University of Alaska has always enjoyed a sort of not normal student body, in the sense that oftentimes many older adults return to school to pursue their career, or maybe get a degree for their first degree. What are the challenges providing educational experience for those older people who come to campus?
Well, first, I think students who've had some experience in the real world and then come back to campus have a better sense of what they want and where they want to go, and actually in many ways are easier to serve because they have a clearer sense of direction. And so that part's a plus. On the harder side, I think, they also, I don't think of students as consumers, but students who come to higher education have certain expectations of how we serve them, and if we don't, we hear about it from them. And so I think it forces us to be better at providing good services to the students. I think financial aid issues are a little bit more challenging. It's much easier to just look at a parent's income and decide, as opposed to a student who may be 24 or 28, and parent may or may not be a factor. So the calculation of how much financial aid we should provide and we can provide is a little bit different. I think it's really positive in the classroom experience to have a range of ages in the classroom, so that students learn from each other as well, in both directions, the young learning from the older and the older learning from the younger.
Well, this raises an issue, I think, that affects everyone who's associated with the school. Given the Title IX violations, given the effort to bring guns on campus, and the perennial one for decades was whether we should serve alcohol on campus, and it was wise to mix alcohol and students. So given all of that, it sounds, it's sort of a tightrope. You want kids to come to campus and be exposed to new ideas and options. On the other hand, it's our obligation to protect them. How do you balance those?
Well, it is a tough balance, and I think of it more as a razor's edge because of the cuts you get from it. But I take a fairly civil libertarian view of it, which is that is accepting what people want to do as long as it doesn't hurt others. But then we have that obligation to protect against harm, which certainly gets into any sexual violence or other violence on the campus. It is a tough line, and I think something that colleges continue to struggle with all over. Having a somewhat older student body, I think, means even more that we don't act in the role of parents. The old in loco parentis was the term back in my college days, where you expected colleges to essentially be parents to the students. That's not the case today.
The other thing that UAF has always distinguished itself was distance learning. And given the state, that's not surprising, but with the advent of the internet and all sorts of options for higher education, classes from all over the world, how do you see technology playing a role in the academy going forward?
Well, the university was an early adopter. In the early 1980s, before most others were even thinking about it, we were doing audio conference classes, and I think still retain an edge in that. Others, I think, have moved much more rapidly and effectively into things like the massive online courses. I think we still get a lot out of the smaller audio conference courses for people who are spread throughout rural Alaska. And I think there are some areas where we could potentially do a better job of exporting what we have in specialized areas, tribal management or the emergency management, or some of the Arctic-related sciences, remote systems, sensing, et cetera, places where we have a real edge. There's the potential for us to create coursework that could be sold throughout the country. I don't see the courses that others are delivering as being that much competition for us. I think the student body that is coming to us is mostly place committed, and while they may take a few courses online, are really looking for a more comprehensive educational experience. So while we're not leaders in a broad range, we still can use it as an effective tool.
You know, you mentioned something. You've been very active in the university circumpolar place.
Mm-hmm.
And we champion this school as a circumpolar, really, research center, the best in the nation. How do you see that changing under the dynamics currently underway?
Well, I'm worried about the loss of budget support for some of the Arctic activities, and as the state's appropriation comes down, or has come down, that creates some real challenges. We are, on the research side, clearly the leader in Arctic research in the nation, and one of the leaders in the world. When you look at, say, the International Polar Year, you look at who did people want to partner with in the United States, or where there were partnerships between colleges in doing the research. One of the studies done by the University of the Arctic looked at how did those partnerships work out. Well, there were lots and lots of universities with 3 or 4 or 5 partnerships, and there were a couple dozen with as many as 10 partnerships that on the published materials, and there were a couple in the 15 or 20, and there was one with 100. And that was the University of Alaska Fairbanks. That's how sought after we are, and how much more respected we are internationally than we are in Alaska, which is kind of a surprise. And people want to, people look to us because we have great scientists, and one of the reasons is this is a great place to do Arctic science. And so the people we have really make that difference. How that will play out in the future, I'm hopeful that we continue to play that role, and not just on the research side. On the academic side, the University of the Arctic's academic office is based here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and we've been a major part of that now international association of 170 colleges, universities, and research centers that care about the Arctic. We have students who student exchanges, not as many as we'd like, partly for budgetary reasons, with students coming from Scandinavia, from Russia, and going in the other direction. So I'm hopeful that will continue. I'm really worried about what's going on at the federal level with climate change. Over half of the research done at UAF has some link to climate change, and if those words are so scary that we're going to cut off funding for them, that's, other than being a head in the sand approach to science, that could be really dangerous for UAF, for our federal side.
That's right. It used to be for administrations that were uncomfortable with climate change and the economic impact that would have, used to say, well, we need to study it more, so more dollars were actually spent for research. Mm-hmm. Now it seems like, well, that research is fake, bogus, so we won't fund that.
In the first round, we changed our language from global warming to climate change. Global warming was something that people didn't want to hear about, so we all started talking about climate change. I'm not sure what's going to come next to try to mask what there is. I'm sure there's some people out here who know what that is.
We'll check with Information Insights on that one. Well, the other thing I want to talk to you about is this role of the university. Wendy put her finger on it when she says, I come from a liberal arts background. So I've always viewed the university as a place that cultivates a citizen as much as a professional. And it seems to me now that the university is increasingly trying to adopt a more sort of practical approach towards fulfilling certain roles in commerce, rather than trying to do a broad-based sort of comprehensive approach to education. I don't know if I'm right, but Do you have a sense about that?
Oh, I certainly agree with you in terms of seeing what's going on. More thinking about universities as vocational, that the role is to prepare someone for a vocation as opposed to its role to prepare for life. And I think we've lost a lot in not continuing to focus on the value of a liberal arts education, a liberal education that includes foreign languages. Those requirements have gone away. That includes, that makes critical thinking a key part of the curriculum. And you know, it's interesting, people talk about how business is looking for the kind of skill set of a business major or of a computer science major. But if you look at the Fortune 500 companies and who's leading them, the largest majors are liberal arts majors. Why? Because they know how to think critically, how to integrate across disciplines. And so now many of them may have gotten their master's degree as an MBA or something like that. But you know, the largest bank in Alaska, NBA, the leader was a history major. We learn, I think that learning is still very important to us. And I think we lose something when we only think about college preparing people for the work environment. I also think we lose something where we're saying we want to get you in and out in 4 years. You know, hurry up and finish, as if it's finishing is what's important rather than what you're getting while you're there. I mean, if it was up to me, I'd say take a year off either before college, take a gap year, or take at least a semester abroad, and don't worry about the fact that that may mean 4.5 years, because what you learn from other cultures, what you learn from other experiences will hold you in good stead as well. But that legislators are unwilling to fund schools that don't focus on the vocational.
You know, I want to wrap up and ask you about what's ahead, because I've seen on Facebook you've made retirement look pretty darn good. On the other hand, having gone through your resume and vita, it like I had to take a speed reading course to get through all of it. So I know you are still active. What's ahead for Brian Rodgers?
Well, in the short term, I still continue to chair the board of the University of the Arctic for another year, and active in several nonprofits, the Nature Conservancy and Foraker Group, among others. I have a new grandson, 5 months old now, and I'm learning how much value there is in not thinking about anything else and just spending time with a youngster. We continue to travel a good bit, living primarily now in Port Townsend, Washington, with a son just across Puget Sound, another one who lives and works in Vail, Colorado, and we try to make sure we're there for 6 or 8 weeks during ski season. So some of that, and then sort of keeping options open beyond that. Retirement is a healthy time of life, and you know, I think when I was young, I thought mid-60s was old. Now I know it's not.
Funny how that perspective changes.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was one of the conferences I was at once, the speaker was talking about aging and how if you had asked in the 50s how many people, what's old, and you start with 60, 70, 80, and people would say 60s, and then it was 70s, and now most people don't consider old until 80s. And maybe by the time we get there, we'll think it's 90s.
Yeah. Well, usually, Brian, at this point, I open up for questions from the audience. So we'll take some questions from people out there. And what I'm going to ask is, since we're taping this, once you ask your question, give me a moment and let me sort of summarize it for the tape. And so we can post it online. So, Rich Seifert, I see you eager to pose a question.
Yeah, I had the good fortune to put together a course last fall in OSHA Lifelong Learning on the history of the permanent fund. And I didn't know it until now that actually Brian served under Steve Cooper when he was in the legislature. But I brought Steve Cooper up here to talk about it since some people I know had advised me to do that. And I would like you now, because of all the ferment and discussion and animosity about the permanent fund dividend, you were in the legislature during 4 crucial years of the whole evolution of what became the permanent fund, the evolution of the dividend. What's your perspective on that? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
So I'm going to summarize and say you had a history associated with the development and of the permanent fund. And do you have any insights about how it's currently being addressed by lawmakers and voters?
Well, I was on the staff of the State House of Representatives when the constitutional amendment passed, establishing the permanent fund, and all the discussion at the time was, we're doing this because we need money for when the oil runs out. The dividend really didn't come about until about 5 years later, and in the 1980 and 1981 sessions, we were looking at several issues. One being that the primary benefits of the state's largesse were accruing to Anchorage, Juneau, and Fairbanks in that order, and much less to rural Alaska. We were looking at how do we ensure that the permanent fund didn't go the way of Alberta's Heritage Trust, which is it got spent. So how do you create a public constituency for a strong permanent fund? And so a group of us came up with the dividend, the initial dividend approach that was thrown out by the courts, and then the backup plan that actually became the plan. And our goal was to preserve the fund until we needed it. And the dividend was not as popular in the initial years. In fact, it came very close to being repealed by the legislature at one point. The revisionist history that sort of says the reason for the fund is the dividend is revisionist history. It's not what actually happened. The dividend certainly has had a major impact on affecting poverty in the state and is a very beneficial program, but that was not its original purpose. It originally was, how do we ensure that there are public services? We're taking a resource that has been here forever, and how do we not use it all in one generation?
Another question? Oh, John Davies.
So you answered a little bit a question about the rural campuses. Could you revisit that question and talk about it a little bit in the context? We started a little bit earlier with community college assimilation, and a little bit more about how you think that went and then its context in terms of rural Alaska.
So rural campuses and their relationship to community colleges.
So in the restructuring process, taking away the identity as separate community colleges was the most controversial part of that process, and one that I think Wendy Redmond and I were least comfortable with in terms of losing that identity as community colleges. The plus side was we were trying to create a system where moving from the first 2 years of education in a community college into a 4-year institution was as seamless as possible. And I think we're relatively successful, especially when you compare to other states, in making it easy to transition from a 2-year education to a 4-year or beyond. But there's a certain responsiveness that you get in community colleges because they are so focused on the communities they serve that I think we lost. And I think in most states, local governments fund part of the community college, and that's another thing that makes it very responsive, primarily teaching institutions. And so our rural campuses today and the schools in each of Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Juneau as well that serve the vocational and associate level programs, they're critical to how you provide a comprehensive public education system in the state, and I think are needed in every community, and in the way we serve the smaller communities, the ability to use distance delivery or classrooms in public schools to teach classes where you can get critical mass of at least a half a dozen or a dozen students. That's important if we're going to really truly serve the entire state.
I wonder if you could talk about the role of college athletics, the value of it to the educational mission, and where it fits in your mind in the priorities of the university such as ours.
So athletic programs in their value to the institution, to the academy, and where they fit in priorities.
And I think athletic programs are important to a public higher education. In part, it's one of the ways we connect to the community. And I talked earlier about how important it is that the community, you really have to engage the community in order to have their support when you need it. If the only time you go to the community is when you need help, and you're not providing some things back to the community, that's not a very good relationship.
Right.
Athletics is one way you do that. You do it through a lot of other ways. KUAC in this community is one of the best ways we connect to the community, but having ski trails available, having lots of events for people on campus do that as well. Student athletes, it's a small part of the student body, but they graduate at higher rates than the rest of the student body. They maintain higher GPAs than the rest of the student body, so they pull others along. And I think part of that is they have really good time management skills. They have to if they're going to play. I think it's important to have athletic programs that the community wants as well. Certainly a move, there was a proposal to add bowling, I think, for UAF. That's not something that I would favor. I don't think that would bring a lot of community support. Now, proportion of budget and how much of it should be provided by the private sector, I think, is a good issue for discussion. As a percentage of our budget, in Alaska, athletics is a lower percentage than it is at many universities. As the amount of revenue that we're getting from the public, it's also on the low end. And so, I think right now, I think we're barely squeaking by with enough to maintain NCAA membership. And I think if we were to cut it further, we might lose that entirely. And that loses a whole cadre of supporters. It also, if you look around the Fairbanks community at who've been leaders in the community, whether it be banking or insurance or service industries, many of them are people who either grew up here and participated in UAF athletics or came from elsewhere and to become Nanooks. And so to me, I think that's something that is important. It has to be balanced with the others, and so the kind of reductions we've seen are painful, but I think we're necessary, and it's nice to see the community stepping up and paying more to keep athletics alive.
On that point, it's interesting that Wendy Redmond observed in many other state institutions, many of the lawmakers in their capitals are alums. And so there is a sort of a deeper connection or loyalty to the institution. And what you're describing right now is that sort of loyalty and support expressed on a community basis.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. I saw it, Quentin.
Similar to some of the previous things, I think we need, with Brian's experience and exposure, to discuss his thoughts on the UA Scholar program that President Hamilton brought in. Basically, has it been a success, and should it and is it likely to be continued?
So the UA Scholar program.
I was a big supporter of President Hamilton's move in that regard. I think the thing that made it unique was his decision to do it on a school district by school district basis, so the top 10% in every school district were UA scholars. That ensured a much broader representation of in the entering classes and ultimately in the graduating classes. And I think with the idea of moving to what Wendy was saying, of more UA, UAF, UAA, UAS alums being part of the legislature, that will help that to occur. The Scholars Program has been, I think, very successful. It has, some students have come that have been underprepared. We've learned that some school districts are not as strong as others, and I think that's meant being prepared to do more to help them in their initial years. I certainly hope that it is long-lived. I know that President Jim Johnson was part of the administration when it was created and was an advocate, and so I'm hopeful that he will keep that program going, and I hope that the stock market continues to do well enough that the investment of our land grant trust funds are able to support that.
Terry?
Going back to your work in the legislature, it's my recollection that in 1980, your bill was the bill that started the energy standards for residential construction and also did the energy audit program. Is that correct?
So when you were in the legislature, the energy audit program and those initiatives began during your tenure, and you were the author of some of them?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun in the legislature with a wide variety of legislation, but the energy standards, the legislation that we created, a comprehensive energy bill, included the first energy standards for the state. Later, I think the state did a really good job of implementing that. It took a little time. I had the opportunity yesterday to take advantage of the first bill that I had co-sponsored that became law. I walked around Creamer's Field, and the refuge, Sally Smith and I sponsored the bill that made that into a refuge. And so, you know, the opportunity as a legislator to have impact, whether it's energy, university, Creamer's Field, or others, was part of the fun of being in that role.
John?
Can I follow on that with a comment? I was hired by the state survey to come back to Alaska in 1981 to create the state seismologist program. And shortly after I came back, I went and visited a certain legislator in Juneau. And he pulled out his typewriter, and while I was sitting there, we typed up a bill that established the state seismologist program office.
So earth-moving legislation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, in the legislature, I had a great staff, and I think the same thing has been the case throughout. Is to me, a successful leader is always one who can attract quality people who get excited about the work, and that's one of the things I think I was most proud about as chancellor, is putting together a leadership team that really cared about the institution, with deep roots in the institution and the community, and who were able to get a lot done. You know, you mentioned, we talked earlier about the facilities issues and focused on the, you know, things like combined heat and power, but being able to make a difference for the teaching faculty as well as for the research faculty, and then being able to make a difference in student life, the Wood Center addition or improvements to outdoor activities. All of those are part of what you do, and I've gotten credit for a lot more than I did. It really, I'll take credit for hiring the right people. And they're the ones that were able to pull off some pretty amazing projects and new starts, whether it be the Center for Energy and Power and what Gwen was able to do there, the unmanned aircraft activities, lots of things, the Vet Med program. All of those required a lot of work by a lot of people. And as a leader, you always feel a little bit bad about taking credit for all of them that happen on your watch. It's other people that make that difference.
Well, it's interesting that Mark Hamilton said almost the exact same thing, that his success, whatever he achieved, is really due to the team that he formed and seeing that through. Well, we'll have more opportunities to talk with you, Brian, at the reception. It's in the Akasofo building lobby, and traditionally you lead the procession.
Okay.
So a little pressure here.
All right.
But yeah. And it sounds like the doors are locked, if I heard that correctly. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Brian Rodgers.